start giving the introductory remarks, and then people who will join us in the meantime will just be in time. All right, so welcome to the language part of the conference. On this panel, we have Mark Bickert, main figure of this conference, Bert Hodges, Ruth Kempson, and Eleni Gregorou-Michalaki, if I'm saying it right, representing a joint theoretical front. And last but not least, Joanna Rončašek-Leonardi. So we will follow the same structure that we followed with the previous panels, which you should be familiar by now. With the discussion, we will see like if on the guiding questions I sent you, and we had a little bit of back and forth, are useful, then we will follow them. But if we drift somewhere more interesting, then we will do that. Okay, so for the recap part, so how about we follow the alphabetical order, which means that Mark goes first.
Okay, now?
Yes.
Well, in some ways, what I want to say about language is fairly simple given where we've been so far. Of course, it gets complex as soon as you start trying to burrow down into it a little bit. But the basic notion is that any organism interacts with the world. And that's its fundamental way of connecting to, relating to the world. There are no epistemic or other kinds of inputs and no epistemic or representational other kinds of outputs, but those sorts of phenomena are emergent in various kinds of interaction. So perceiving, acting, language are all interactive process. And to be a bit more specific, I argue that language provides a kind of a conventionalized toolbox for operating on social realities, as opposed to ways of interacting with a small rock or something like that. They're all interactions, but what makes languaging and certain kinds of communication interactions special is that they're interacting with social realities. That, of course, begs the question or asks the question, well, what are social realities? And the model I propose is a model of social realities as situation conventions, the situation convention being a term that I invented. So what's a situation convention? And here, I'm using the word convention in a way that fits the gist of David Lewis's model of convention, but not the specifics of Lewis's model of convention. Lewis proposed that, well, first of all, Schelling, let me go back to Schelling. Schelling proposed what he called coordination problems. If you think of this in terms of game theory often looks at what are called competitive games, where if I win, you lose, or vice versa. Schelling was introducing what he called coordination problems, where I don't win unless you do too, and you don't win unless I do too. So in a payoff matrix, the definition of a coordination problem is that there are two or more possible joint outcomes that all of us would prefer over all the alternatives, but none of us have any particular preference within that class of joint outcomes. So we don't care, one of my examples is we don't care whether we go to lunch together at place A or at place B, relatively speaking, just so we both end up in the same place. So we have to coordinate in order to do that. And the standard way of coordinating, of course, would be with language, where we talk about how to get there. Lewis proposed that conventions are solutions to coordination problems. So maybe we have a convention of always meeting for lunch at place A. Now, he was directing his arguments against a Quine argument, who said, well, look, language can't be convention, because what would be the language in which the conventions of language are established? So if we've got to have language to establish the convention of arriving at place A for lunch on Tuesdays, that works as long as we got language. But if we're trying to account for language itself, how can we possibly do that? And Lewis was arguing, he didn't use this vocabulary, but he was arguing against Quine that there are other ways to establish conventions, including these repeatable conventions, these conventions spread out over people and time, that did not require explicit negotiation and explicit agreement, and therefore did not require language, and in particular could be established by what I call precedent and habituation. So my kind of standard example is, if we both arrive at place A for lunch one day by accident, have a nice conversation, maybe we both show up the next Tuesday, kind of hoping the other person will show up, and so on. It doesn't take very many Tuesdays before which we have a convention between us of going to place A to meet on Tuesdays for lunch. And we need never have discussed it to do it. So that's convention by precedent and habituation. And that's what Lewis was arguing for. And I basically agree with him, except for his purposes, at least to a first approximation, he could define conventions in terms of regularities of behavior. And it's these joint regularities that constituted the solution to the coordination problem and therefore constituted convention. I was asking a different question. I don't necessarily disagree with Lewis about the conventionality of language, but I was asking, what does language interact with? What is the proximate locus of interaction? And the sort of obvious answer is, well, other minds. I'm interacting with your minds right now. Well, that can't be entirely false, but I suggest it's misleading. Yes, I'm trying to interact with your minds right now in my utterances, but that's indirect via my attempting to interact with the social situations of our common understandings right now. And those kinds of situations need never repeat. And perhaps in many, many, many cases never do or never can. The exact sequence of words that I've used up to this point establishes, hopefully, if everything worked okay, a common understanding, therefore a convention, a solution to a Schelling coordination problem, about how to try to understand the subsequent words that either I or you or somebody else has to say. And if those in fact give us a common way of trying to do that, they will constitute a solution to a Schelling coordination problem, but never repeat, or at least potentially never repeat. So situation conventions in that sense are still solutions to coordination problems, and in that sense, conventions, but they are not necessarily what I call institutionalized. So driving on the right or left side of the road is an institutionalized convention. It repeats all the time. Calling a meeting to order is a convention, at least sometimes, and it repeats partially, but it repeats a lot. Incidentally, the calling the meeting to order with a gavel or something like that, or the one if by land, two if by sea, with the lanterns for Paul Revere. Those are communications, and they are ways of manipulating situation conventions, but they're pretty limited. They can be quite useful, extremely powerful, and so on in their own limited way. But I tend to distinguish language in terms of it being a conventional means for productively constructing potentially new ways of interacting with social realities. For some purposes, that makes a big difference. For some purposes, it does not. But many of the properties of language that we like to talk about turn on the fact that we are constructing ways of interacting with social realities. So the interaction with minds is there, but it's kind of like my common example is, yeah, we interact with the atoms in a teacup when we're drinking tea, but that's not proximate. We're proximately interacting with the teacup and then indirectly interacting with the atoms. So I'm attempting to interact with the common understandings among all of us right now. And in so doing, I have to also be interacting with everybody's minds in a way that maintains, hopefully, the commonality of understanding that constitutes the social reality among us. So to take minds as the proximate locus of language interaction, I think is at least misleading and wrong in the sense that it overlooks, it ignores the fundamentally social nature of language. Incidentally, I might comment, the fundamental social nature of language is one of the characteristics of language that it looks to me like everybody in this group accepts and assumes and flatly disagrees with Chomsky about. I mean, I've heard Chomsky relatively recently claim that language is not fundamentally social, it's fundamentally cognitive, it's fundamentally for revealing, he didn't use the word encoding, but encoding mental contents and so on and so on. He gave, as typical of Chomsky, he gave no argument for this. This was just the Chomsky assertion that we're all supposed to accept because it's Chomsky asserting it, but anyway. Okay, so the social nature of language is one that we need to keep in mind, not that that's news to most anybody in this group. One of the corollaries of that is that the social nature, I argue, is a social operator interaction nature. It's not a semantics or representational nature. And we've talked about this before, that utterances can manipulate, can construct, can modify the representations in each of our minds that, if in fact they are common to us, constitute an aspect of the social reality that we're involved in. But the utterances themselves are operations on those social realities. They're not representational per se, except in a kind of an obvious, potentially derivative sense. And in that sense, I take a semantic approach or a representational approach to language to be fundamentally difficult to deal with because it's fundamentally misleading. You can sort of start to try to handle it, but you get into difficulties very quickly, I think. If you've got a representational model and you've got a string of representations, a classic problem is, how do you get the unity of the utterance? How do you get Russell struggled with the unity of the proposition throughout his entire career. And he could not figure out a way to get the unity of the proposition if the propositions are constituted in these little singleton things in the world. James, of course, talked about this. You take some sentence and you assign each word of the sentence to a separate person. And then you have each person focus real hard on their particular word. And then you squeeze them in a corner. But no matter how hard you squeeze, you'll never get an utterance out of it. It just doesn't work. So I think Frege's operator move was an absolutely major, absolutely essential move. But A, he didn't go far enough in the sense that he still kept names. And B, he didn't go far enough in that his operations were themselves encodings of operations. And that's not the way operations work in language. But anyway, another corollary to this is a universal context dependency. Operators are always dependent upon what they operate on, as well as on the operation, as well as on the operator who's doing the operating. So there's context dependencies all over the place. And even in the sense that Frege was coming from of mathematics, you can define a function on the integers that has a constant result. So I define a function on all integers whose result is always 3. Well, it sort of looks like I could identify that function with 3. And you can get some one-to-one correspondences out of that, but functions don't have the same properties as numbers. So ultimately, they're not identical. And what we've done in moving to this name way of thinking about language is, A, make this move operators as always producing the same result, and then equating the operator with the result that it always gives. Well, they don't always give the same result, number one. And number two, even if they did, it doesn't do from a metaphysical perspective as well as from lots of practical perspectives to treat the operator as equivalent to the result of the operation. So there's a universal context dependency. It's always there. And even in formal languages, it's there. Formal languages are the attempt to squash the context dependency as far out to the margins as you can go. But it's always there even in formal languages, in that you can't define a formal language except in terms of ordinary language. So there's your context dependency. You need the ordinary language in order to formally define your formal language, and you can't get away from that. And even proper pronouns like empire state building is context dependent on people understanding that particular aspect of English and knowing that little bit about New York or something like that. It doesn't work if you're talking to someone who's not in that particular contextual framework. And of course, context dependency has been kind of a big deal with Kaplan's character, indexicals, demonstratives, et cetera, et cetera. But most ways of thinking about language have not recognized the universality, let alone the necessity of some version of some kind of some degree of context dependence. This was kind of indirectly alluded to when I was talking about formal languages. There are some reasons why language development and historical language development moves toward broader and broader contextual dependencies, which means in a certain sense, less and less context dependence. You can never eliminate it, but you can kind of move toward it. You can, I mean, a little kid, a 2-year-old, a toddler, is highly, highly, highly context dependent. What the toddler is communicating cannot be understood without knowing very much about what the context is, the physical context as well as the social context. And one of the themes, one of the tendencies in language acquisition is to become more and more skilled at broadening that dependency, with formal languages perhaps being one of the broadest. Written language, of course, reinforces this tendency because we may not know who our audience is. But even with written language, if you're writing a paper for a technical journal in which you can assume all kinds of technical knowledge on the part of your audience, you do it differently than if you're writing for a more general audience, and so on and so on and so on. These audience context dependencies cannot be dismissed. But it is also the case that language development works in the converse thematic sense. We become better and better and better at taking into account and making use of these particularities of the social context in which we're talking and operating. We become better and better and better at participating in a meeting and making our points in the meeting and building our points off of what somebody else has just said, and so on and so on and so on. So language development does both. Language development both moves toward broader context dependencies as well as increased skill with very particularized context dependencies. Okay, I can obviously go on there.
Yeah, Mark, we hit 15 minutes. So if you have final points.
I've got further points, but they're more responses to some of the questions and so on. So
okay, yes, so we can address that in a moment. Bert, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself.
Put me on mute and share my screen here.
Could I have my video put back on, please? This is Ruth Milligan. Somebody turned off my video.
The chair, can you see the screen up my screen okay now?
I see conversing is perceiving. Yes, I do. That's good.
Bert, yes, but wait a second.
I will see. The question is whether I see me, but that's all right. Go ahead.
Ruth, you have to, at the bottom of the page on the left, you have mute, and next to it you have video. So you have to click that video and it should show you.
Yeah, the thing is, it won't. And that's because my pussycat got curled up in front and my video was turned off by with our last session, so it has to be turned on from your end. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's okay.
Like a nuisance.
Okay, Bert, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Well, I'm going to try to, I'm Bert Hodges from the University of Connecticut. I'm going to try to talk about an ecological approach to language, conversing as perceiving, acting, and caring. First, just a few words about an ecological approach. It sees organisms and environments as intimately related, that is, made for each other. It focuses on perceiving and acting as the most basic form of cognition, where cognition is understood as being in touch with the world. It is a psychology of values, according to Gibson, rather than a psychology of stimulus. In perceiving and acting, we seek meaning and value. We perceive, he claims, affordances, which are meaningful opportunities for action that can lead to good or ill. Perceiving and acting at their most basic, he claims, are direct. They are forms of knowing, not guessing, and skilled action, not shots in the dark. Now, I don't think there's really an ecological approach to language. Lots of us have been working on bits and pieces, so here goes. Here's 3 questions about language I'll talk about briefly in this talk. What is language? And I'm going to argue that language is an action system, a perceptual system, and a caring system. What is language for? I'm going to argue it's for realizing values, or alternatively, we might say for wayfinding and caring for ecosystems, others, and oneself. And how does it work? I think language is physical, social, and moral. It's a dialogical method for extending time and space, for perceiving good prospects and participating in ecosystem agencies. So all perception, emotion, all action, perception, emotion, and thinking are values realizing, I claim. Conversing is also a values realizing activity. By values, and here's the main project I've worked on, is values are the boundary constraints on ecosystems that define their dynamics and the directness of organisms' activities within them. So this is quite different from the usual ways people use the term values. Just remember that. They guide the selection, coordination, and revision of goals and affordances. I've claimed that there are always multiple goods that define even the simplest ecosystem or the simplest task. They're hierarchically related. Values are in a cooperative tension that's dynamic. There's no fixed ordering of values that are, rather they're mutually constraining. Any trade-offs or hierarchies are temporary and reversible. And values are also what I think legitimate our tasks as humans, epistemic, ethical, and aesthetic. They're not the same as natural laws or rules or goals. I think goals and rules answer to values, and values are the basis for coordinating laws and rules. Language is not, I think, about acquiring or activating some formal rule system called language. It's not conforming our utterances to some local patterns of sound, syntax, or semantics. It's not simply asserting truths. It's not simply persuading others to match our expectations, or simply coordination or cooperation. Rather, my hypothesis is that it's a way of caring for others, for ourselves, and for the world. Now, this caretaking hypothesis is a form, suggests that conversing is a form of seeking, of finding our way in a complex world, a world that cannot be entirely comprehended or controlled. Thus, speaking and listening are always prospective, even when the topic is the past or the present. Conversations are always in search of good prospects. That is, conversing listens for openings that afford continued conversation, but more importantly, that give promise of new, richer ways of acting, thinking, and feeling. So as a perception action system, perceiving and acting are always social, so it's also an interaction system, which is Mark's point. The main hypothesis I've developed clearly aimed at playing off acoustic arrays and optic arrays and haptic arrays that ecological psychologists talk about that are informative. I've talked about dialogical arrays. What I mean by that is that it's a group of hearer speakers surrounding a given speaker hearer, listening and talking in ways that provide information about the common ground they literally share, that is the immediate physical, social, and moral situation in which they all find themselves. It can provide information about places from which people in the array have come and the events in which they have participated. It can even reveal something of the intentions of the array's participants regarding their prospects for future events and activities. Dialogical arrays help to locate us in a much larger world than the one provided by our own point of view. It extends any individual participant's perceptual reach, both temporally and spatially, by orders of magnitude. Dialogical arrays invite us to go beyond the horizon of our common ground. These arrays are jointly created and sustained. Only in our active probing and being willing to be probed is it possible to learn about our situation and its prospects. As we probe with questions, declarations, exclamations, proposals, and all the other modes of linguistic looking, we can increasingly come to see, much as in ordinary vision, our real prospects for doing something worthwhile together. In dialogical arrays, we form a collective for purposes of perception and action at a distance. Now, do these arrays only provide indirect knowing and doing? It might seem that at first, but I think within real communities over serious stretches of time, they often can function directly. Quoting from a paper I wrote with Carol Fowler here, directness of language lies not in some deductive certainty, but in the subtle social and moral dynamics of real physical bodies, dialogically arrayed, that have directly shared and cared for a set of places and tasks over a common history, working to do the next thing that needs to be done for the good of those places, those tasks, and themselves. Furthermore, dialogical probing by each of the parties in an array allows for reasoning in the sense that Mercier and Sperber have recently described it in their book on argumentative reasoning. That is, the everyday sorts of discussions in which we challenge and correct each other's biases. It turns out the evidence suggests when groups care about finding truth or solving a problem, they usually challenge the limitation and biases of each individual. Other individuals challenge me, I challenge them, and such that groups nearly always reach a stronger view and better solutions than they would have otherwise, often better than anyone in the group would have done alone. The strength of argumentative reasoning, though, depends on the diversity of perspectives within the group and some unity of purpose. The reason we miss, I think, this directness is that we miss the dialogical and social nature of knowing and doing. Even Gibson and Ash, two of my heroes in psychology, both share what I see as an enlightenment bias, that somehow my own perceiving and acting is to be always preferred to that of others. Others may know more and do better than I, and I may be aware of that from my own experience. My own perception action experience may inform me of that. Furthermore, we've generally learned, I think, as humans, that knowing and doing is best carried out and evaluated within communities over time, not by lone individuals. By engaging in the discipline of dialogical arrays, we are strongly encouraged to slow down, to consider other perspectives, and to attend to longer timeframes, so that we question our own very limited and fallible perspective on events. If language is viewed as action, then the criteria for evaluating it is no longer grammaticality. As an action system, language contributes to the ability of communities to engage in collective action over greater stretches of time and space, which enables the creation of new affordances. Language contributes to coordination, to sharing, to caring, all of which are constitutive aspects of culture. From a values realizing perspective, the central fact of language might be named answerability, which is Bakhtin's term for the obligations inherent in addressing and being addressed in specific historical circumstances where action on behalf of others and oneself is required. Again, quoting from this paper with Carol, when humans speak and listen or write and read, these actions irreversibly place us. They locate us in specific physical and social ecologies, and they emerge from temporal scales ranging from evolutionary and cultural to interpersonal and microneural. To postulate a question, a statement, or even give a grunt or groan is to locate oneself, to take a stance with respect to oneself, to others, including predecessors and successors, as well as to those to whom one now speaks or writes, and to the geographies and tasks within which those selves are located. Actions, including those of ordinary conversations, cannot be done without pointing to oneself and to the responsibility entailed in speaking or listening. So language, finally, is a caring system. At the heart of language, one finds not a biologically hardwired formalism for syntactic well-formedness, but a complex set of moral, social, physical skills that are jointly shaping actions in search of good continuations and good prospects. Every aspect of language involves the selection and shaping of movements, from pronunciation to syntax, from word choice to the choice of addressees. All of these implicit, largely unconscious choices depend on values realizing dynamics. Truth, kindness, justice, economy, clarity, coherence, and complexity are among the obligatory demands that constrain and enable sentient speech. So the creativity of language, I think, is primarily about creating new possibilities for responsible action rather than generating new sequences of sounds that are grammatical. Finally, an illustration that gets me on more on my social psychological home turf here is how can a view of language of the sort I've just described, how can it help us radically reinterpret research that's usually understood in this case in terms of social pressure and conformity? These are the Ash experiments. You have a line on the left and we have to match the line, choose one of the lines on the right to match. The questions are all very straightforward. If you look carefully, you know the right answer, except for 3 or 4 or 5 other people have just said the same wrong answer before you. What we did that was different about this is we viewed this as a conversation, which no one else had ever done. In Hodges and Geyer, we argued that the deep dynamics, we tried to describe the deep dynamics of the situation, and we argued their values realizing dynamics that are affecting the pragmatics of how participants converse, although they are unlikely, I think, to be aware of these dynamics themselves in some conscious sense. The dilemma that Ash presents is a moral dilemma, I think, more than an epistemological one, is what should I say when I believe others are wrong? How does one pragmatically engage others with whom one disagrees sharply? This simply describes most of our politics now. The surprising results are, even though these are known as conformity experiments, overwhelmingly people dissented. 2/3 of the time they dissented, 1/3 of the time they agreed. It turns out the most common participants, which no one had ever described in anything before we talked about it, they typically disagreed 9 times out of 12 and agreed 3 times. So that's what really needs to be explained. What's going on? It looks like they're just being inconsistent. What's happening here? So we argue there's some of the salient values that we think are involved in the Ash situation. Truth is one, expressing one's own view accurately and honestly. Justice, how do I do justice to everyone in the situation? The experimenter, the peer, my peers, myself, others to whom we are accountable. Trust, how do I take seriously the value of others' claims and in a careful way? Social solidarity, which is not about just me belonging to a group, but it's a commitment to contributing to the good of the group and to the values that sustain the group. Truth would be among those. So the dilemma then becomes, how does one speak the truth in a complex, tense, and frustrating situation in a way that simultaneously honors one's peers, the experimenter, one's own perception, and the situation in which they're all embedded? More sharply, how to do all of this in any one utterance? Realizing, I think, values pragmatically, the average participants in Ash's studies may have been signaling awkwardly, but as best they could, the tension and truth of their situation as a whole, with the hope that it would leave them and their peers open to further dialogue. If one did what I think Ash hoped his participants had done, that they always disagreed with incorrect peers, it would signal distrust and a lack of social solidarity. It would likely be a conversation stopper. By agreeing occasionally, even though they make their dissent clear, agreeing occasionally keeps the dialogue open, even in awkward and threatening situations. I think that's crucial to learning what's truly the case. So finally, just to notice several things to tie this back to the conversation we've had about language. Participants in the Ash experiment cared about truth, but they also cared about others and how they could work together to learn what was really going on when there seemed to be this surprising disagreement. The rules of the experiment did not allow for genuine dialogue, so they couldn't talk, they just had to do what they could do. And what they did was, I think, creatively and cooperatively scale up their utterance to a larger time and over a longer period of time, so that the most common response is one of dissent while signaling that one has heard others correctly, indicating that there's a sharp disagreement that needs to be resolved. Participants capture the larger truth about the situation rather than being trapped by the all or none dilemma that Ash thought he had created. So participants had opened up a new set of affordances by moving to a larger temporal spatial scale. Thank you.
Right, great, thank you. Thank you, Bert. Okay, next we will have, I believe, Ruth speaking for the duo, right? And traditionally, you have to unmute yourself.
Once I've started, stopped muttering is the answer to that one. Hang on. I'll continue to share. There we go. Okay, so here we go, and it's 7:30. To me, it's 6:35. Fine. Okay, well, I wanted to pick up on something which we certainly agree with Bert about, which is that language contributes to coordination. And we're going to take that very literally. So we have this view, which we call dynamic syntax, and this is about language as action, actually, interaction. And so, hang on, I can't get it to, I'm sorry, I can't get it to shift. Oh, yes, I can. Okay, here's the thing that we're doing. There are parallels, the striking parallels. They're so striking, I just don't think it's a coincidence. And this is what this talk, and in fact, our work has been about. So the first part of this slide is very straightforward to you all. And this is Mark's challenge to language modeling. But I'm giving it to you. So we've got change as the default, and it's stability that has to be explained. And non-determinism, process, and interaction are basic. And I'm giving you this other list because this is what we pick up on in dynamic syntax. So this modal anticipation of actions as predictions, what Mark called a little while ago, modal potentialities, this progressive differentiation relative to local context, allowance for change in error recognition and correction, with interaction being central, and actually no mind reading. And these are all essential to getting a decent account of language and psychology. So we're told right correctly. And so we actually define language as process. So we're taking the comment I made about Bert as language contributing to coordination very literally. So this is a model which is defined in terms of anticipatory actions, multiplicity of parallel affordances, and context dependency. These are central. So we've got under specification plus update actions, and these are core syntax. These are operations which put the elementary parts of the trees that we've got together. They're context-dependent actions, all of them, and they drive both parsing and production. So there's incremental construction of content and word sequences, and we get interaction and dialogue as an immediate consequence with the ability to model error recognition and correction modeled. Okay, so now let's see. This is what I'm going to take you through. I'm going to take you through one extremely simple example so as to try and give you a very, very swift idea of why it is that we get interactive role switch so seamlessly. So for us, these anticipatory actions are central. The grammar actually comprises these general lexical actions, which are routinized through multiple use as affordances for action, followed by speaker and hearer. And I should stress, these are not trees for words in sentences. These are trees that represent the growth of content or the emergence of content. And the interactive role switch, which we're about to see, is seamlessly achieved without mind reading. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to take you through an utterance, which I'm Ruth, and my son is called Hugh, and they have a dog called Gray. So as I utter the first word, who, the system allows me as one possible strategy in both parsing and production that I can start building a configuration, which in this particular case, I'm trying to build a proposition. So it's got this requirement, this anticipation that what you have to achieve is something of type T, that's just a proposition. And within that, we build this node, which is completely unresolved within, except knowing it's in this local domain. And we put in there a placeholder. That's what linguists tend to use for WH terms, and that's just a placeholder for somebody to provide an answer. And then with it, again, there's another requirement, and it's a constraint that this underspecified tree relation has to be resolved during the process of emergence of the structure. And now we get find. This is the second word I'm uttering. I'm saying who found. And find itself, we know, is a two-place predicate. But here we're building semantic structures. So this is actually three-place. Am I not going to be able to? Yes, here we are. we're treating this as a three-place predicate because we're wanting to express what it is that the tense operates here. And here, this is the beginnings of building an event term. So we have find here, and this is giving us what it needs for the adicity of its predicate to be satisfied. But because this is English, and English says that when you've got something immediately before a full formed tensed verb, then that thing will be identified as subject. So part of the actions which the word found initiate are indeed the identification of this subject once it's been built in by the solemn step-by-step actions which are induced as actions associated with this word. These two will unify. So once we've done that, now let's pause, because I have taken you through this as the speaker. I am producing this thought and I'm choosing these words to say who found. But by claim, this is like a grammar, it's a language, so that the hearer is also following exactly the same structure, because these are conventions which are generally held in knowing the English word. You know it's a two-place predicate, and you'll know all these. These are affordances, in fact. They're affordances for action followed by both speaker and hearer. So at this point, Hugh can simply take this structure and impose on it the goal he wishes to use to complete the word. And lo and behold, we will get the utterance of Ray, which then with me as hearer will then say, okay, this is find, and now it goes to go with Ray as the object to give us find Ray, which will then combine with the subject to give us, in the end, who found Ray in the past. So we've got here, notice what we've got is interactive role switch, seamlessly achieved, without mind reading, without any need to impose extra coordination processes. It simply comes from the assumption that language is about languaging. It is the process of building up representations of this sort for purposes of coordination. Okay, so now I want to go to the next slide. I had one other more. Oh, sorry, I've gone back. I'll switch to this. Yes, one more thing I wanted to say, and this is, you might say, well, come on, this is just a very, very simple structure. It can't possibly do the whole thing. But in fact, we argue and have shown it cross-linguistically that if you in fact treat these complicated structures like relative clauses, you treat them as linked predicate argument arrays of this sort, which are induced with shared terms, which the language also gives you procedures to enable the associated sharing to achieve these effects, then you can characterize anything that you want to characterize in language. Now here, see, why is this so successful? Well, this is because no other grammar formalism that we know gets remotely close to characterizing this problem of what we call speech split utterances. But in fact, speakers and hearers and even small children fluently exchange roles across all dependencies with changes, corrections, evolving and mutating content, context, intentions, and speech act. And here I've simply given you another little set. I've changed one example for those of you who came to the seminar, so you see something slightly different. But here, this is a BNC, British National Corpus example, and it starts off where the transcription is actually very hard, but it then comes into, they used to come in here for water and bunkers, you see. And the respondent ships in water and bunkers, coal. They're all coal for, notice what this is. It's taking up what somebody else has seen and repeating some of it, but then adding a modifier and then adding an explanation. And this is all perfectly fluent conversational utterance. And then there's a second one where you have a school and a deputy arguing about which units they ought to get rid of, which in the current culture in which we live is rather a sad, common type of conversation. But the deputy head can complete the school's head by saying axed. And notice she can't say axed, because once you've got should as an auxiliary, then it has to have the non-finite unmarked form of the verb. So there are restrictions here, which again are imposed by the words and the configurations and the conventions of languages as we've learned them. And notice she could then go on and say none, hopefully, and these are fragments. They're all fragments which can be interpreted relative to this immediate context. And then we get the two examples of the lawyer and the client, where one's opening up with a question and the respondent is repeating it by turning into an answer. And notice, as I go to the fourth one, that small children do this very, very naturally. So the teacher says, and your name is Johnny, and your name is Mary. It has exactly the same split utterance effect, changing the nature and mutating the kind of utterance which is being uttered. And these are the data, these are the only data which small children are exposed to, talking in conversation with other people. And notably, other people can't characterize this. Okay, so here's the general statement of what we say. that in fact, this is an interactionist model of language. So the diagram, the beautiful diagram by Eleni on the right, is showing you what's happening. So overall, we claim that the unit of analysis is a group-based distributive cognitive system. And it's the landscape of collective affordances which defines what is available. And we're using affordances here in the somewhat enriched Gibsonian notion of affordance as is given by that as Rietveld et al. And Buineberg and co. And what they characterize affordances at is given in the sentence just below, that in joint action, participants' abilities, the socio-material environment, and history of interactions, these co-determine a particular subset of the field of affordances. And so now you can see it in the diagram on the right, that within this overall landscape of affordances, we're assuming there are a field of solicitations, and this is where the heart of language contributes, the conventions, the situation conventions, to use Mark's term. And the so-called common ground is actually a property of the relation of individual participants' affordances. So in that sense, it's part of the affordances which are in the common ground, which are in the relation of the individual participants' affordances. And the very fact that we're going through this as by word or incrementality means that such fields, these fields of affordances, they're redefined and transformed with each utterance, the verbal or otherwise word by word. That's the situation conventions, and they're operated upon at each step. So there we're really taking the full geometry of what languages offer you in terms of affordances, emergent affordances, to give you these emergent configurations. Okay, well, that's actually only half of the story. How much time have I taken? Nearly. That's only half of the story, because one very major thing, which has been worked on by Eleni and other colleagues, is to actually define what I, in the previous slides, as gave you the earlier DS, in a multimodal form, which was, she talked about more in the longer talk we gave. And this is an incremental and predictive architecture which integrates multimodal action, which includes perception and language in a single model, with ongoing research to probe in experimentally controlled context how words, phrases, gestures, physical actions, etc., all contribute to determine the unfolding dynamics of the socio-material environment. And then, well, there's ongoing work on different languages too, as a matter of fact, that's ongoing. But the other thing, which I and colleagues, including Eleni, have been working on, is a distributional semantics for DS. And the aim here is to model the flexible meaning of all words, the polysyllab problem. And this is where I take issue with Ken, actually, for saying that English is a mess, because this is a property of all languages. In fact, pretty much all words in all languages. There's this massive polysemy, and linguists have just ignored it. They simply say, I've got pronoun 1, pronoun 2, pronoun 3, pronoun 4, and they are quite content to posit endless ambiguity without ever confronting the problem. But the intuitions here is that we really need to characterize word meaning in non-deterministic terms if we're ever to capture this. For this flexibility of content, it's not just content either of taking the word in isolation and put it into a context. It has a perfectly clear interpretation. The very nature of words is that the interpretation we assign to the way in which we use them is filled with non-determinism at every step. And that's what the words manifestly display if you're somebody like me as a linguist who's really concerned with what is a word qua word. But so the other intuition about turning to distributional semantics is that collocations gathered from vast data sets is perhaps surprisingly a basis for seeing variability of meaning right across a community. And of course, the results have to be interpreted. Statistics don't give you an analysis, but still they give you the kind of data for seeing how a community can use each of these words in a very stretched way in virtue of the collocations which are gathered in these vast data sets. So that's, as a working methodology, that is something I'm very interested in pursuing. Okay, now just to round up, really, have I got time? This is the points of discussion which we think we have as parallels. And maybe we have, our interpretation is not so different from Mark's either. So here are the parallels. It's absolutely fundamental to both of us that this is a processual ontology, literally a process. Their emergent notion of representations and symbolic encoding of some sort. There's in DS, we have what we call DS, a constraint-based framework, and that parallels the implicit presupposition of background conditions that Mark tells us of. We have utterances as action macrometers, and these are operators on the fields of affordances to give us situation conventions, and in the same way as Mark, that will give us an emergent notion of social normativity. Then we have anticipatory, predictive articulation of courses of actions. And here I wish to stress that morphological information gives you far more information than just what people think of content. It guides process of content. It gives you boundaries. It gives you guidance in how to create a construction. It gives you guidance on what kinds of inference to draw. And it gives you guidance as to speech act control. And all of these are constraints. And there's much work that needs to be done there. So the language is giving us states of action readiness, and we agree with Bert that in fact this is going to be driven by emotion and values rather than rational motivations, higher order levels of reasoning, or indeed mind reading. Of course, we can do mind reading, but on our account, it's not the essence of the way in which coordination is achieved, for example, in dialogue. So it's essential to this story that we have no factoring into syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And we think we're achieving a theory of coordination for language rather than a model specific to communication. And then I think I'm just going to stop, because all I want to say now really is, what do cross-disciplinary explorations buy us? And if you look at the list below, you'll really see that most of our speakers are listed here. And we like to say, well, we think that, or we hope that this is evidence coming from you all buttressing DS as an interaction resource, for which many thanks. And you might notice in passing that those two last utterances of mine are both fragments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and now we have the last speaker, Joanna.
I have to stop sharing.
I think if Joanna starts sharing, it should replace it, if she's going to share. You're muted, yes.
Yeah, I as usual, I lost the button to, let's go to the beginning. Okay, thank you. I wanted first of all to thank Jed, Rob, Adrian, Mark. This has been wonderful, really, and it's really great that we can meet. And similarly to Ruth, I think that we find continuities. And it's great because we are complementary, I think, in many things, that we work on slightly different things and come from different angles, but we find a sort of mark in the center. and it is indeed great that we can sort of pool our resources and not just be redundant. What I'm missing a little bit till now is perhaps talk about methodology of our research that we should pursue. I think we should massively change what is being done with language in psycholinguistics, in language development, and we still are not very sure how to do it. So if we could steer a little bit the discussion towards this direction, that would be fantastic. As I know that Mark is also very deeply rooted in philosophy of science, so could give great guidance. The other thing that I'm missing, and this my talk will not be so much content loaded maybe, and I didn't try to squeeze as much as possible in it. But nevertheless, Rob, do tell me that when I have 1 minute left, okay? It is more an extended question based on our talks. This was also great that we could talk before a little bit. It's an extended question to Mark about the necessity of form and the replicability of form, that with language, I think it is very much visible. So I wanted to give you a little bit of the background, although Bert has done it wonderfully for ecological psychology. Well, for a linguist to come from ecological psychology, it's a kind of an uphill road and kind of hard, because everything in ecological psychology is really dynamical, is a process. I don't know if Mark would agree, but I think the ontology of ecological psychology is pretty much, it's assumed to be processes. And so we study dynamics, we study coupling to the world, and it's really very difficult to understand how on earth in these dynamic processes and dynamic processing that we do when languaging, we can find something that for years the structuralists have been describing as a system, as not even a static system, but as something that has very, very visible, salient systemic character. And it's also probably the most amenable to a symbolic description part of our acting in the world, the language. And therefore it has been described for many, many years as a system of symbols. And you know, it really is. It is a beautiful system, very intricate, very, very multi-level, hierarchical, and so on. Of course, there were multiple efforts to capture it in a grammar, and of course, it always spills out, as we know. But how in this process ontology we can account of such a stability, in a sense, of a stable system of symbols? Do we say they don't exist? Symbols do not exist? Okay, fine. But tell me how for so many years people could be deceived so deeply and describe a system of language as a system of symbols. And you know, for years I've been searching for a framework that could actually give me both. And also, as an avid ecological psychologist, I thought, okay, let's do away with those symbols and to describe everything as processes, as dynamics. Fine. I mean, I don't mind, right? So I was searching if it's possible for cognitive systems to really have just rely on dynamics. Well, I found, of course, the work of Polanyi, the work of von Neumann, who said, of course, this came through the work of Howard Patti, about whom I will talk in a minute. But well, there were those frameworks who could give a place for both, for systems of symbols and dynamics together. There were conceptions that actually advocated for the need for irreducible complementary descriptions in those two modes. And as you know, Polanyi would say that physics doesn't deal with function, and laws of physics cannot really give us the functional constraints that are imposed on those laws of physics to keep us far from equilibrium, right? Von Neumann advocated for the necessity of internal description for evolution, for the possibility of adaptive increasing complexity in the face of the environment. And of course, the most complete discussion came with Howard Patti about the place of dynamics and symbols within explanation of cognitive systems. And there was, as you probably remember, there was a beautiful debate in the 80s between Fodor and Pilishin on one side, and then there were all the Connecticut people like Turvey and Carello and Michaels and so on. And then in the middle, there was Howard, who tried to reconcile both sides, saying, hey, you cannot, I mean, these are the two sides of the coin. You cannot really do away with symbols when you are talking about living things in general, and language also too. So the Howard's vision was, of course, that those symbols are not abstract entities. They are physical, and they have a role of controls or constraints, structures of controls on the ongoing dynamics. And this is where this inspiration came, that perhaps we could look at language in the same way, because this is actually a fantastic thing to find a place for a symbol, for a linguistic utterance, which is not a part of mapping, right? When you talk about control processes, you stop talking about encodingism, as Marquis says. You stop using the mapping metaphor, because language is just a constraint. It's a pusher for the dynamics that is already there. But nevertheless, it may have the degree of arbitrariness with respect to the control processes. It may form a symbol system, which is actually called by Howard a generalized language, and which is replicable as this within the system. The system sort of provides for the stability of replicability as well. And this is something that I'm sort of missing from our talk today in general, and about talk about language too. So the question is how such control systems, such intricate and beautiful, complex, structured control system can ever arise from dynamics, right? And of course, Howard asked it on the level of living things. So he asked about how it can arise in life, in cognition. I think those are huge questions, of course. And well, we try to see how it arises in development, where also when you look at the environment of the child, really the symbols are not there for the infants, right? So we looked at the from the perspective on language development as differentiation, segregation from other action streams. So we assume that we are starting from dynamics and trying to get to such symbol systems. Let me just switch off, because there is probably some noise. It's probably better now. While we are doing this, we also are trying to show the necessity of this complementarity. Can we resign from this complementarity, that we have to actually stick to some symbolic description within language? And when you look at the development, language in development, it's obvious that especially the ecological perspective also gives this to you, that it's going on in a very rich environment of not just objects and things to map on utterances, but actually language is an action in the environment that is engaging, actively engaging an active child. So there is a social physics around the child, which has to be navigated through language. So I agree very much with the conception of language as a sort of attention device, or a feeler, that a perception action system. That's maybe the Gibsonian way to say it. So again, a question that we ask here: how can a layer of behavior become? So we are interested in trajectory language for an infant that starts with a dynamic processual environment. However, whenever a child can say, okay, now I'm using language, whenever the child can even realize that such a thing as language is around, because at the beginning there is no language for an infant. There are utterances that are floating within the complex environment, right? So there is, of course, no simple mapping as well. When you look at in early interaction, of course, you realize that words or sounds or utterances, they are accompanying, preceding, following, punctuating events, soothing, irritating, drawing attention of a child. They resemble some sounds. They have some timings, dynamics. They are actually within multiple relations, and they are not associations, but relations to whatever is going on in the environment. And whatever is going on in the environment are not only perceptions and actions, but are also feelings. And this is a very important thing, that those are coupled to experiences also of the world, right? So I think the word of association is really doing a lot of damage in psychology, and because whenever the two things are together, they are not just superimposed, or there is not just a conjunction of it. And this is rather that one is selecting an aspect from the other. And this is something that we also, I think, miss. This is this deep relationality of things. So what we see in this beginning of meshing of language in action, gradually, what also caregivers do is trying to push a child into this vocal layer in a dialogical way. So language, of course, is never deployed as single words, or almost never. Sometimes it is in a simplified way to the children, but the parent talks all the time. And then there is this, we can see that there is this emergence from this action and language meshing. There is slowly differentiation, segregation, and integration within the system of the vocal modality, which does become a modality. It is never separate, but it does become a modality. And it's very strict. The parents very strictly follow the rule that when a child vocalizes, I should vocalize within 500 milliseconds or 1 second. Here you have a nice peak that shows it in the recurrence analysis, that whenever a child vocalizes, the mother vocalizes shortly after. Whenever the child produces a more language-like sound, the mother will respond with language. Okay, so this is an increase of and reinforcing the speech-like modality to the dialogicity also. It is happening in dialogue, as you are all saying. So you can see that there is an emergent but still grounded system that is forming within development, and it's through the emergence of coherence within the system. The child is hearing collocations very often. It's of course superimposing some constraints beyond existing coherence of interaction. So we have two layers in a sense. One, the language layer is supplementing more constraints from segregated, replicable, culturally replicable system onto the interaction that is going on here and now. And of course, well, here I wanted to say again that this is where we can see that we cannot think about compositionality as trivial compositionality of those signs that are associated, right? These are deep relations between those symbols that start to form a layer, but they are connected. And here is the model of Terry, and based on pairs, how it can happen that it can function as a language. So at first, the language functions as icons, using the pairs terminology, icons, indices in the social physics, pushing the baby, directing the interaction one way or the other. And then slowly, when the child, because of emerging vocal modality, starts realizing that words go together, then the relations between words, and again, not an association, but relation between the words, can play a controlling role on the relation between the actions and interactions in the world. And this is where this miraculous, the birth of the symbol comes when the directly perceivable, there is a lot of course, of Gibson and William James here, directly perceivable relations between the vocal layer can act on directly experienceable relation within interaction, right? So this symbolicity is only within a system. Therefore, this is the semiotic infrastructure that we are relying on with Terry here in this model. And it's what we are trying to do now is to actually show that it is happening in the interaction, and computationally model it as well. So, but the important thing is that you have a sort of a double grounding of utterances. First grounding is in interaction, where it pushes around what we do with the child. The second grounding is within a system of other utterances. And these two resemble what Patti is saying about this irreducibility, because one grounding sort of is able to unground from the other grounding. That I am using a particular utterances with other utterance will mean something different in the situation. Well, it's banal, it's obvious, but this is why it will mean something different, because it's used with another utterance. So this is what we are doing now. As I said, do I still have time, Rob? It doesn't seem to be.
I mean, it's just so interesting that I let you speak. But yeah, like about 2 minutes, if you could wrap it up.
Okay, because yeah, I thought I'm doing a little bit, maybe spending too much time on it, but what we are trying to do is actually to see how right now we are at this stage. I have to minimize this. We are at this stage where we try to see how it might happen that from, for example, a pointing gesture and a word, we are coming to two-word relationships guiding the utterances. So we go back to Brunner to see how actually utterances can be complex controls in the interaction. And what we see, and we try to take advantage of this, is that utterances are first used, as Mark said, extremely context dependently, even though the mother always uses also context independent language with a child. But when it's used context dependently, it's like this, that the baby is literally moved sometimes, and the utterances are deployed. Like here, the mother says hands up, and the up is very iconic, but then it comes with the word hands, and the baby's hands are touched and brought up. I mean, this is might seem an exaggerated situation, but we can see a lot of this, of creating opportunities, enacting opportunities to see for the baby how the relation between the words actually impinges on whatever is going on. So the other line of research is to actually show it in agent-based modeling, which is hell. We have a grant for doing this, and it's really very difficult to see how first used icons or indices suddenly can become symbols because they are making a relation, because of this double relationality or double grounding. All right, so the question that I wanted to ask is that, okay, we all agree that language is a resource for interaction. I really love this phrase from Ruth and Eleni. It provides constraints on already meaningful interactive situations or conventions, situation conventions, as Mark says. He doesn't like the name constraints. He says operations, okay, but I think we are close here. So it has a power to refocus of values realized through language. As Bert was saying, this is what language actually does. It provides constraints for our interactions to realize more values or more synchronously values, etc. But it can refocus values, goals, hierarchies, as I think Booze was making this very nice comment the other day, that it has this power of changing our attention in a situation, and then allows construction through representing constraints of situated meanings of ourselves in situations. Of course, it provides constraints only, as Ruth said just a moment ago. This allows for play, flexibility, novelty, always context dependency. But are these special, Mark? This is a question to you, to everybody. Since they are preserved in something resembling or arguably describable as a system, are these constraints more precious, more reliable? Why some constraints enter into language and some, for example, remain on the level of routines? Can we answer this question? Why? I mean, this is probably the same question as about DNA in a cell, right? But why are these constraints given such a systematic and cheaply reproducible form? So that's the extended question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thanks again to all of our panelists. So I think those like short summaries were already informed by the questions that we discussed a little bit through emails. So, so instead of just imposing the structure on you, let me just ask if any one of you has some issue that they think we should address first. Some comment on the race question and so on.
You're talking about the questions that you emailed out?
Yes, I mean, whatever emerged now, because the questions, I can see that they nicely were intertwined in your talks, in your short talks here. So if you want to pursue any one of them, please indicate that, or maybe some of the issues that were brought up just in the talks right now are more pressing and would be worth pursuing first of all.
Well, I have a lot of comments about the talks, although I'll defer to Buse about that. But in terms of the questions you raised, I found one of them rather interesting, and that is, how can we be in error about fiction or within fiction?
Okay.
And I take that to be a particular case of how can denotations be wrong in a certain sense. But I think the general answer goes something like this. Language is a constructive process. It's an operation process that constructs things. One of the terms we have for one of these modes of construction is narrative. Narrative constructs further representing about such narratively constructed contexts. And it can be wrong. So if we can be wrong about something in fiction, because the fiction itself has constructed a contextually constructed representation system. And we can be wrong about that contextually constructed representation system within that context. So it's not wrong context independently that Sherlock Holmes was 104 years old, because there's no Sherlock Holmes to be talking about in a context independent sense. But within the context of the narrative that constructs Sherlock Holmes, that would be wrong. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting one, but I'll now defer to Buse.
I think
Hi, this is Ruth Milliken, if you don't mind. I'm still shut off, but at your end, yes.
Ruth, we can shut off video and we can shut off microphone, but we can't turn them on. If you
can't turn them on. Okay.
If you
All
move
right.
your,
Well, eventually, I'd like to make a comment. So whenever there's.
Oh, definitely. Or if you just move your cursor on the bottom of your window, there should be little icons, and the video one, if you click on it, it should allow you to turn back on.
It doesn't.
Okay.
No, something was actually done at your end.
This happened earlier with somebody else. If you click on it twice, so that it turns off and then turns on again. There you go.
There you go.
Oh. All right. Thank you very much. Who was that? Okay.
You suddenly appeared.
Like the lion.
Halfway through the afternoon.
Swamp Ruth. Swamp Ruth.
Well, you disappeared, and there was a cat there for about 20 minutes.
It's just about the cat, right? The cat.
Yeah,
that was why I was turned off, I guess, because the cat got it. well,
okay, I think the issue that Mark brought up, about like how can you be wrong about fiction, it connects with the ungrounding issue that Joanna is talking about, because the idea that language becomes like is grounded in the context of other language of language system, right? It's independent of the situation. Then that's kind of what you were talking about, Mark, right? Like that there is the context of narrative, there's the context of cultural stories, and then you can be wrong about that. So, John, would you like to chip in on that?
Well, I never thought about it, but yes, I also, just before I go to that, I just wanted to make also a comment that I loved the view of language progressively actually broadening the context and not being ungrounded. So this is also something that is worth pursuing. But yes, I mean, there is a way to use language at some point that is very grounded very little in interaction, and it seems that in some form of autism, for example, we focus more on the systemicity than on the pragmatics or the controlling way, the controlling power that language has. But in terms of fiction, I never thought about it, so I do not know what to do with it. To tell you the truth, maybe somebody else.
Okay, or we can just move on to a different issue. So, yeah, so I see it works well if we allow the audience to also ask questions, to take part in the discussion, because there are not too many of us. So, so if any of the panelists has comments about the fiction stuff,
about the fiction stuff, no.
Then let's do that. If not, then we have Buse and then Terry and I assume Ruth later on.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. And what caught my attention was how you emphasize that the meaning is not fixed, but distributional. And while I was actually thinking about the structure that was building with additional words, it reminded me that that distributional flexibility, I would say, is still not fixed. For instance, the misunderstandings. So it's not just, the structure is not just building up with the addition of the words, and the words that came prior constrains the distributional meaning of what will come later, but it works the other way around. So what comes later actually can go back and fix the misunderstanding, and that distribution is still open, and it's not still fixed, but somehow constrained. So I was actually like a bit curious if you have any further elaborations on that part, how that constraint still is like stable in a sense, so that the further constraints can be actually made, but it still leaves open that potential error to go back and fix. So I was just curious about that.
Eleni, do you want to answer that, or shall I?
I wanted to say that exactly that is the reason why we have this field of affordances, and you always have if you're doing it probabilistic, you have a probability distribution of the different paths that you could have taken down the trajectory of the system, but you didn't. But these affordances, the possibilities that were not taken, are always there and can affect the evolution of the system. So you always have the possibility of, you always have these affordances co-present there, even though they have not been taken explicitly, affecting what is going to happen with the system. And this is due to the particular model of affordances that we are using, where you have always the option to switch immediately to some different option. And this is available both for both the participants in a conversation. So we model both the speaker and the hearer in the same model. And if they happen to diverge in their interpretations within the system, within the constraints of the system, they are able to converge at the next stage, even though convergence is not a necessary desideratum of the system. But if I realize afterwards that I have misunderstood, I've gone down the wrong path, I can return, I can backtrack, and I can remain on a path similar or close to what you are going down to. And that's not only for misunderstanding purposes and clarifications and all that, but also because even when you're correcting something, you are able to use some anaphoric reference that refers to the part of the language that you have rejected as a correction. not only that, but also we have things like puns and jokes and quotations and all these other phenomena that need to be modeled. And if you have that, if you have this monolithic point of view that what we do is we construct a string of words with a particular interpretation and everything else is ignored, you will never be able to get an account of these kinds of phenomena, which is the creative uses of language. But you always have to maintain all the options open, even though one of these paths, as I was showing in the slides, one of these paths explicitly is taken up by one of the participants. So that's a very good question. And that comes from conversation analysis, that then next move addresses both what went previously and what is coming next. So it's prediction and retrodiction all the time.
Thank you very much. A very quick follow-up would be then, how does this not taken potentialities of the distribution doesn't exhaust the system's capacity, or it's still like, it takes some kind of an effort and energy to be able to still, like, as the conversation, as the time passes by, it increases exponentially, I would say. So
that's absolutely true. I mean, it can become intractable unless you allow decay. So further options decay as you go along. You obviously you do not have everything that was available at one particular stage always being available. I mean, that's an empirical issue, how much the distribution decays for the oldest options, indeed.
Okay, if we before we move on to a different issue, does anyone else has a comment on this one?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. Okay, so then Terry.
All right, just two comments. I'll try to be brief. The first one is that many people have asked me, that is someone who began studying language with Noam, diverged from that, went on to neuroscience, and now is spending a lot of time on issues that sound like origins of life. What could possibly be the connection? And I just want to just point out a connection. It partly has to do with the relationship between Joanna and I, and why we've both been developing these different directions, but they overlap. And if you'll remember from my presentation, it's really a presentation about moving from dynamics to something that is non-dynamic, that now can interact with and coordinate and control the dynamics. That is the 3 steps that developed up into a template that now has the ability, because it's a different kind of structure, to interact with the dynamics. And it's that relationship between something static and something dynamic that, of course, was the essence of Howard Patty's idea, that there needs to be some source of constraint that is not what he calls rate independent, that is, it's outside of the dynamics, not modified by the dynamics. Language acquisition, as I see it, and I think as Joanna sees it, is one in which children are learning to use this affordance of a very different kind of thing, this set of utterances, that can now both stay linked to the dynamics, but now interact with the dynamics and modify it, because there's a kind of displacement, separation, a distinction in which they now become separate. And this brings me back to a question that lingers always in my thinking about these kinds of dynamical, interactive relationships of language. Because something that seems to be missing, and this is something that caused my arguments with Noam to grow over the years, a question that he's recently put into the title of a book, and I think comes up with a wrong answer, and that is, why only us? From an interactional point of view, from all of the interactional discussions we've had so far, there is no clue, no clear clue why it should be us and not other species, why it's so difficult for us to get other species to follow even a modicum of linguistic function. So I'm going to leave that question, why only us, with those of you who are linguists.
Well, I think, can I say, I mean, I think this is where the non-determinism has to come in. So for a frog, let's say, a frog can, you know, take a pebble if you've got it wrong, I can't remember which of it was that provided that. But the restrictions are, the affordances given by the situation and the options they have are very restricted. What a child has to acquire in using language is to acquire an ability for it to be non-deterministic. So that's why a very favorite example I think I gave last time, I'm not sure if you were there, is when this little 2-year-old sitting on the back of his mother's chair, and he had been with his father the day before tidying up the boat, and the boat was taken back to the mooring. He pointed to the empty place on the canal path on the other side and said, "Daddy." And of course, he knew this was with his mother. She would provide him the schema, the frame, the skeletal architecture within which they could make sense of that together. So she said, "Yes, dear." She didn't correct him. She said, "What on earth are you saying, Daddy?" She said, "Yes, dear, you were here with Daddy yesterday, tidying up the boat." So the child is always, the mother is always providing these richer set of affordances, these which are associated with these words. And the child has to, through coordination with her, get a sense, because he was said to be correct because he was pointing to an empty place. So it wasn't as though it was picking out that individual. It was precisely being a label for a much more amorphous event in which the grounding in the environment was really, really very indirect. You know,
so I think I am basically what I'm saying is I am completely convinced by the interactionist story.
Right.
It just doesn't answer this troubling question that's been with me since.
Oh, why only us?
Yeah, it does a wonderful job of talking about what we do when we're language competent, but it doesn't answer the question that ultimately Noam Chomsky posed for us way back when and gave us, I think, a terrible answer. But nevertheless, it's still the question.
But it is a multifactorial problem, and that's why. First of all, it is a matter of degree, because we know that loads of animals have the capacity to acquire language. They do not have possibly the vocal abilities that humans have, and they also do not have the concerns and the sociality, the type of sociality that we have as a species. And it's not that they cannot learn language because they do not have some kind of ability to construct a system the way we construct it. It's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of what they care about, as Bert would say. I mean, it's not an unsolvable problem if you think of all the multiple factors that go into culture, sociality, vocal apparatus, to constrain the ability of other animals to behave like us. Why should they? They do not have the same concerns.
But Terry, I know that you were studying at least brains of the dolphins too. So aren't they close to something like, because they have rich sociality, and it seems that language is a navigation system for sociality. So what about them?
The work of Lou Herman is probably the closest who've come to that, who's worked with a series of dolphins and done combinatorial communication, trying to get them to do simple combinatorial work. They do seem to. Their communications between them, the only thing that's at all close is what we call signature whistles that they give, which is when a new dolphin comes back to its pod, it basically makes a sound that says, "This is me, and I have this distinctive whistle." It turns out, learns it from their mom. So it's passed down, but it's about the closest we have in dolphin. So the key is in the natural world. And I certainly will take exception to the claim that it's just a matter of degree. I don't think that there's an essence to this. I mean, I've worked with almost everyone who has studied the animal-like communication and the attempts to train animals, to chimpanzees, to gorillas, to orangutans, to dolphins, to African gray parrots. I mean, there's fundamental differences, but it's not an essence. I agree with Eleni that it's not an essence, but I disagree that it's just a matter of degree.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to go back, if I may.
Yes. So let's put the question of that Terry.
Well, this is the question I'd like to speak to. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. So Ruth, and then Mark, then Bert.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to something that Bert began with, and then he didn't really elaborate on, but the idea that understanding language is a form of perception. This is direct perception, and I've been arguing this for a good many years. I argued it very carefully recently, from a very different point of view. I mean, I just have very different background information, but one of the things that he mentioned, or well, one of the things that I'd like to mention about that, if you think about ordinary perception gives you almost always the relation of what you're perceiving to yourself. So it's perception for action. Now, a TV set, of course, is, that's a weird thing in the modern world. But forgetting TV sets and telephones, what's true about understanding the world without language is that you have no way to perceive what is not something, as it were, within your reach. That is not for something. And my own suspicion from looking at the animal studies very carefully is that actually to understand something about the world, but about a part of the world that you cannot manipulate. In other words, you're understanding something which is not for action. It's just a fact, a brute, dead fact. I don't think any animal does that. I think that's peculiar to humans. And it definitely goes with language, because that's exactly what language does. Suddenly, it makes you perceive something which is not in a relation to you that you necessarily understand. That's a very big jump. Anyway, I just wanted to introduce that. Anyway, I really believe that's true. Let me just give you one tiny bit of evidence. If somebody could find me an experiment where somebody has taught an animal to do something without a reward, I would like to see it. Whereas children look at all the things they learn without a reward. The animals don't learn anything except something practical. They learn affordances.
Okay, thanks. Mark, do you have a comment on that, or do you want to start another?
Well, I have at least comments on 3 different things here. I've been accumulating notes on them.
Okay, go ahead.
One should be short. I think this is in response to a comment that Joanna made. I'm not sure. But anyway, I would certainly agree that a lot of the literature, less so now, but very strongly so a couple of decades ago. And I made this point in my 1983 Gibson book. The only real process language we had back then, this isn't literally true, but the only real process language that people considered was computationalism. And I pointed out that at least in the standard conceptions of computationalism, it presupposed representations. It presupposed what some of us at least were trying to account for. And the field had forgotten cybernetics and control theory. And that's what connects with what Joanna was saying. Cybernetics and control theory, I think, was a disastrous rejection based most primarily on the book Perceptrons by Minsky and Papert. And we could get into that history more if you'd like. And of course, cybernetics and control theory has been having to be rediscovered with robotics and autonomous agent theory and so on and so on and so on. But anyway, okay, so that was one point that I think I just wanted to chime in on. A question that was asked is, how do we get these repeatabilities and what good are they and so on? And I have a couple of comments about that. One is that in this model that I'm proposing, everything is based on apperceptive differentiation. And that is true for language, and it's true for things that aren't necessarily linguistic at all. And a lot of the problems we're pointing to, like context dependency and so on, are true outside of language just as much as they are inside of language. So if I apperceive the world, the way I apperceive it is going to depend in part on what's been happening up to that point. It's going to be itself. I mean, apperception is a process of modification of my interactive knowledge about the world that I'm in. And so the apperceptive process is always going to depend not only on my current interaction with the world, but it's going to depend on the history up to that point, in the sense of what that history has itself constructed. So just like a function, it's, you know, it depends on the argument as well as on the nature of the function, unless it happens to be a constant function. So just to say in different words, something I said earlier, we take this notion of differentiation to kind of a limit point. This is one of the attractions of encodingism. We assume that the differentiations are of unit sets, and then we take which is pragmatically maybe so, maybe not so. But even if it is so, we then take a huge leap and assume that the differentiation represents the element of the unit set. And that one, that's a crossing that can never occur. That's the crossing that takes the constant function that always gives you the result 3 as being the result 3. That's what gives you the name model. That's what gives you encodings and names and so on as a limiting case, but it's an asymptotically limiting case. You can never actually get there. So that's one. Next question was, how do these things originate that can repeat and iterate? And this actually gets to more something akin to Lewis's model of language itself, not just the situation convention model of what language interacts with. And I'll give you an example from Bennett back in the 70s. Suppose you're under a tree and I'm standing a ways away and I see that you are in danger of getting hit by a falling coconut. And we don't necessarily have any language. So I make a bunch of noise to attract your attention. Maybe I point, who knows what I do. I do things. I make vocal and non-vocal gestures. And finally, you wondering what in the world I'm doing, you're looking around trying to figure out what I'm doing and why, you notice you're about to get hit by a coconut and you successfully get out of the way. Okay. A few days later, I'm the one about to get hit by a coconut. And you start making funny noises and pointing or whatever that have some apperceptive similarities to what I did before. And it doesn't take me quite as long to realize you're trying to warn me about this falling coconut. And as things progress, the gestures, both verbal and nonverbal, get ritualized. And by precedent and habituation, those ritualized gestures come to have the apperceptive significance of you're about to get hit by a coconut. This is basically Lewis's model of language as formed, language as conventional, where the conventions are formed by precedent and habituation. And it's a rendering of that example with respect to single gestures. You got to do more than that to account for compositional gestures, but that's the beginning. Okay. The next point is one that Buse was bringing up and that Eleni commented on, and I basically just want to chime in and agree. Apperceptive processes, well, to make use of a Gibsonian phrase, apperceptions don't exist. Apperceiving is ongoing. And in that sense, the products of apperception is itself always ongoing, always ambiguous about where it might go next, but those ambiguities can get partially resolved with later processes. And again, I think that's true of apperceiving in general, but it's very importantly true of language, as you folks were pointing out. And then finally, why only us? I have some discussion of that in the book. And one aspect of my discussion of that I'd like to bring up. One of the things that I think humans are better at than any other species is keeping track of non-perceptually recoverable apperceptive trajectories. So what do I mean by that? Well, the paradigm case is dialogue. Dialogue is quite context dependent, and sometimes so context dependent that if somebody just comes in on a dialogue or loses a step in the dialogue, it's extremely difficult for them to recover the status of the dialogue. There is a situation convention involved in that that we can keep track of. It's a hidden trajectory, but it's a trajectory of the situation convention or the linguistic situation convention. It's hidden in the sense that it's not directly perceptually recoverable, but it can become enormously complicated over time. It doesn't have to be enormously complicated, but it can be, and we're extremely good at keeping track of those things. And I've got a few examples of that that sort of illustrate how complicated it can get, where later parts of a story completely revise our understandings of earlier parts of the story. And this happens multiple times in a row. And nobody has any trouble keeping track of all of that. We can do these retroactive as well as prospective context dependencies and narrowings down all over the place. And then
can you do a simple example for us, Mark? Could you do a simple example for us?
Well, let me try the beginning of this story. It goes on for several steps. Guy comes to the door. Somebody answers. The guy says, "I want to sell you something or other." And he goes through a spiel. And the guy he's talking to invites him in, and they're carrying on the conversation. And then at some point, the guy he's talking to says, you know, this is a standard kind of con game you're trying to play. Revising our interpretation of what was going on in the first place. The first guy, after some resistance, finally acknowledges and says, yes, it was a con game. How did you recognize it? Second guy says, well, I used to be a con artist myself. First guy says, I'm actually going through several steps here. First guy says, oh, you remember XYZ? And the second guy says, yeah, I did that one. And they're exchanging stories about the cons that they pulled off. At some point, the first guy that came to the door says, actually, I'm not a con man, I'm a policeman, and I'm here to arrest you for all the things you just now confessed to. And again, it completely revises our understanding of everything that happened before that. Second guy is all sorry and, oh God, why did I open up like that? Why did I trust you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they go out the door with the first guy arresting the second guy. They get out on the sidewalk and they're congratulating each other about pulling this con on the guy's wife to get him away from the house to do whatever they're going to do. And, you know, again, you can go on, but the basic point is that it's obvious that each phase of this induces a complete reinterpretation of what happened before, number one, and number two, we have no trouble whatsoever following it. It's just something that is trivial for us. And at this point, then I want to call upon the Humphreys model of the very rapid growth of hominid brains at a certain point in our history. And I don't think this captures everything. I think Terry captures some of it. I think there's a lot of stories here that are all true to some extent or another. But with respect to this kind of an example, the Humphreys model is quite good. For those of you who don't know it, Humphreys basically says, look, having social linguistic skills became very important socially to enable reproduction. People who were not good at this didn't get selected as mates. So in effect, is you've got a truncation of the lower end of the bell curve of linguistic skill. And linguistic skill, so I'm arguing, involves this ability to keep track of hidden trajectories. So if you keep truncating the lower part of the bell curve, it's number one, induces a rapid growth, which is what I claim is making us unique in this respect of being able to keep track of these hidden trajectories. And number two, it soon becomes not a bell curve anymore. we have a strong threshold for acquiring at least the minimal language abilities. Some people are not able to, but they are people who in some way or another are seriously disabled or damaged. And the threshold effect means that there's been very, very strong selection pressures on this. So that's the Humphreys model that I would invoke as underlying this extremely rapid development of our ability to keep track of hidden trajectories. And then what difference does it make? Well, I think it makes a lot of difference. It's being able to keep track of these hidden trajectories that underlies the social complexities that we live in. A further one that's a little bit more conjectural, notice in science, we treat nature, we treat the world as a hidden communicator. Not necessarily with the same sort of motives as somebody else, but in the sense that we're trying to interact with the world in ways that reveal what are otherwise the hidden trajectories of what the universe, what the world will do. I can go on and on and on, but anyway, all of that's in support of the basic idea of why only us. I agree it's not completely only us, but I would also agree that one of the things that's very importantly special about humans is this ability to keep track of hidden trajectories as in dialogue.
Okay, thanks. So we have some follow-ups on what you brought up, Mark, but Bert put his hand up first. So Bert, if you want to, if you want to start a new topic, then we could hold on for a second and we could continue this. Or
just a quick comment. I was trying to type it, but I'll just say it quickly. It was more in response to Terry's, but it's related to the other. I think we are unique in that regard. One of the key things, though, I think that Michael Tomasello and others have argued, I think is we're the most cooperative species, at least of the apes, among the apes and stuff. We do share a common ancestor 6 or 7 million years ago, apparently. I wrote an article in 2017 where I was way out of my zone of comfort and expertise reading anthropology, but I made a proposal about what may have happened between 1 and 2 million years ago about becoming bipedal, which led to carrying, which I think led to and we lost our hair, which led to us carrying infants face to face and things. And then eventually the evidence suggests a whole lot of anatomical social changes occurred that may have led to a kind of cooperative intimacy and stuff that makes us care about it. I think our problem with other species is we don't know what they care about. I think language is just like navigating, which other animals are spectacular at. Yeah, if you knock them off course, it's just like us walking into a conversation late. We get lost, but they can follow a track, I think, remarkably well. It's just we don't know what it is they're caring about. We have to guess, and we're not very good at that. So we're special, but maybe they're special in ways we don't appreciate.
Okay, Joanna.
So I had a quick comment about the coconut example. That I definitely agree that ritualization is important and repeatability, but this will not give language. This will give a ritualized or conventionalized even signal, let's say. But the step towards language is the step of the system. I agree here with Patti, and I agree here with Terry. I think that I'm interpreting this well, that you need a system that also has some properness and structure in itself in order for it to be language. And it's not just compositionality, it is the compositionality that makes the system of symbols. And before they are just system of signals, you can say signs, whatever. And you also have normativity that you keep here within this language system, because notice that we correct each other and we try to do it correctly also. So there is a normativity that I think is very important also for Eleni and Ruth, that is sort of guarded by the language system. So that's the first thing. And the second thing was about birds and animals, and I forgot it. So maybe I will come back to it.
Okay, Mark, do you want to get back? And then we have Busay, I believe.
Oh, okay. Just a response to what Johanna was saying. I agree that you don't have language until you've got some kind of system. I disagree with what I take to be the conclusion there, because it seems to me, and I offer a model, whether it's correct or not, who knows, but it seems to me that you can, with similar kinds of precedent and habituation, break down full utterances into partial utterances of various kinds. And these partial utterances of various kinds ultimately form a system, and ultimately, in humans at least, can form an extremely complicated system. But I don't think it really requires any new basic principles. So that's just a response.
Okay, Eleni, you had your hand up for a moment. Do you still want to contribute, or?
Well, I just want to say two things, that I agree with Mark that we don't need really a structuralist system in order to have a language, because verbal language can very easily intermingle and construct, compose with gestures, with facial expressions, and you can construct sentences. We have loads of data of multimodal grammars, as we call them, to use emojis and all that, to use all these other features to construct so-called sentences or utterances. So I don't think that there is a necessity for a system, an independent system, in order to call it a language. That's one thing. The other thing is that I want to say, on top of what Mark was saying about being able to follow a story and change the interpretation as you go along, there is also evidence that if you are in a dialogue and you are a participant, there is experimental evidence for that, you have a much better and different understanding from somebody who is not taking part in the dialogue, who is an overhearer. And why is that? Because the way that dialogue works is as a distributed system where the actual participants who are accountable and responsible for the trajectory of the dialogue have a different kind of coordination between them than somebody who is listening from the outside and taking a third person perspective on the dialogue. So that's what I want to say, that the participation in the dialogue is also something that provides for so-called understanding or coordination. It's not just that that we can go backwards and forwards and understand what other people are saying. It's a different quality of understanding that you have when you are actually a participant than when you are an overhearer.
Busay, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, maybe it's just trivial and very basic, but I had 2 points. One was about Mark's comment about how language actually enables us to reproduce and get selected in terms of mating. And I was just going to say that it might be explanatory that cognitively economic way of communicating actually enables mating, and the meaning spaces that are similar, or the person who is like, I would say, normative, or have the competence to be normative, if we are going to have a degree in terms of normativity, has the capacity to actually like use the linguistic affordances and calculate the potentialities in a better sense, or in an increased sense. In that way, one's empathy increases.
Oh.
What's that?
Oh, that was just an O.
Okay. Maybe I should stop there, and I don't know, maybe I'm getting out of my line, but it was just I thought it was a cognitively economic way of understanding how language enables us to understand each other, and makes us not consume much energy while trying to refer to things, even the absence of things in terms of future or in terms of past. So that was one thing. And I was just going to add the second layer to connect with fiction, perhaps, would be, I think, normativity like enables the system's capacity to abstract, to go beyond from itself only. Because if there's only me, then there's nothing else to represent, and there is no need for me to represent myself as well. And in that case, I think language and normativity has to emerge at once through the potentially like joint attention, the capacity of joint attention, because then one is able to represent someone else and oneself, which only then one can start to expand and calculate the potential point of views, different point of views. So in that sense, anything that is not me is actually the first representation of the absence, because what is not me is not within me. So other is, I can only represent other as an absence because that is unfamiliar to me. And that's an absence because I do not have other. And in that case, the fiction starts, I think, by representing oneself also. So that was just,
All right, yeah, thanks. So if anyone has a follow-up now, before we, because we are arriving at the end of the discussion, I wanted to, so if anyone has a follow-up to this tag, please speak. And if not, I wanted to bring up this methodological issue that Joanna brought up in her recap. So
actually, I remembered what I wanted to say.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm writing a comment to Guze, so I won't take the time now. But perhaps we should also see, it could be informative to see what goes into language and how. Because we had this very nice conference about abstraction, and there was a talk about how olfaction stays always sort of doesn't, in the domain of olfaction, we do not have abstract terms. There is always something smells of something or of something else. Whereas in other domains, we do have abstract terms which have to be socially agreed upon, more and more conventionalized in a sense. So the abstract terms seem to depend more on sociality, let's say, even if this is a simplification. So maybe this is interesting to look at, what gets into language and what doesn't get to language, but still controls our interaction. Maybe that's how we could approach this question. Okay, that's it.
Okay, comments?
I'm not exactly sure what's meant by we don't have abstract terms with respect to smell. I can certainly say I smell hamburgers, or
exactly, because you have to say what is the smell of. Whereas, for example, in colors, they don't always derive directly from your perceptions. Like, I don't know, brown, let's say, it's a name of a color. It's not a color of a bear.
Yeah, they say that in the Bible you don't have blue. It's always a comparison to something that's blue. It's never the abstract concept of blueness.
What about saying a delicate smell or a harsh smell? I mean, aren't these abstract characterizations?
But they are not pertinent to smells only. Like a color brown is a color brown, which is just a name made. There is a very nice paper by Ophelia de Roy on this. So I don't want to detract our discussion here. But...
Okay, so maybe we could turn to the question of methodology. How as Joanna framed it, that given the revolutionary and completely different way of thinking about language, there are like methodological challenges of how to study and so on. Or maybe Joanna, maybe you could bring up the question again.
That was my dream, that we won't remain within philosophy and clarifying the terms that we are using. Of course, this is very important, and to see how we see the processes, how we compare our models. But I wanted to ask maybe first Mark, are there specific guidelines to how we could actually study interaction and language in interaction? In terms of, you know, just, well, the engaged science that we are trying to stay within. Science is also, as Mark was saying, at least at some conferences, kind of a bunch of social conventions, and we can see that they are changing. Of course, they are influenced by everything else. So what are the takeouts for people like us who are who do empirical research?
Okay, I'm not exactly sure what kind of a response really satisfies the question, but let me try a little bit. First of all, I doubt that this is of great relevance to most people here, but it is of relevance to philosophy of science in general and to methodology of science in general. And that is that inductivism, especially in the sort of piling up lots of data and seeing the patterns in the data, A, doesn't exist, and B, would not be adequate even if it did exist. Popper had a very powerful point. You cannot notice, quote, inductively, unquote, that A is always followed by B, unless you have the he didn't use this language, but unless you have the representation of the possibility of A being followed by B. And then you can notice, oh, well, there it is again, there it is again, there it is again. And this is supposed to provide inductive warrant. But it really, well, it may or may not. I can postpone that question. But Popper's original point was it's really hypothesis testing. I have this hypothesis that A is always followed by B, and I'm testing it. And if A is always followed by B, in my experience, then it passes the test, or it doesn't. So that obviously can get into very sophisticated issues, but a lot of people conceptualize science in this kind of inductive manner. The inductive notion of rational conclusion making is strongly tied to encodingism. It's, instead of the signet ring pressing itself into the wax all at once, it's some little stylus drawing a pattern in the wax over time and maybe drawing it over again so that the pattern in the wax gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And it doesn't work for induction any more than it works for transduction. They are both based on bad models of cognition and bad models of rationality, and therefore bad models of science. So how does science work? Well, again, there's no full answer here, but it works via some sort of evolutionary epistemology. It works via the construction of possibilities, of models, of considerations, of constraints, and so on, and stressing them, to use a term introduced earlier today, I think it was, or maybe yesterday, no, today. Checking them against selection pressures, checking them against criteria. And some of these pressures and some of these criteria are ones that we develop. So in methodological senses, we develop control conditions, for example, that will show a different pattern of data, if they are true, than the pattern of data that would be shown if our primary hypothesis is true. And the control conditions, require a lot of creativity to figure them out, to figure out a pattern of data that would differentiate one conceivable hypothesis from another one. And then it requires pattern recognition. Statistics in this sense is really, quote, just unquote, a pattern differentiation process. It's deciding, is this pattern actually different from that pattern or not? And when there's a lot of noise in the patterns, that is not always obvious. If you graph them and it's obvious, you don't need statistics except to get it published, because they will require the statistics. But for your rational decision making, if it's visually obvious, you don't need the statistics. I have a story behind that, but I'll go on. Furthermore, the idea of the alternatives that you want to consider, that you would like to rule out, ideally, leaving your favored hypothesis remaining as the only one that has not been ruled out, is determined in part, or constrained in part, if you like that, by the framework you're coming from. So some kinds of alternatives might seem obvious from some perspectives, but you never even think about them from other perspectives. And that's the burden of this paper that Jed and I wrote, where in developmental psychology, people who are innatists or nativists or empiricists never really think about, especially if they're nativists in the sense that what they call conceptual innatism must be true. They never even consider the possibility of control conditions for constructivist models of representation. So it never dawns on them to construct a control condition for one of Piaget's intermediate constructions of object representation. And if they don't have those control conditions, they're wide open to interpreting the results as supporting their very rich cognitive interpretations of everything. And when people come along and start including those kinds of control conditions, the control conditions are winning out. The control conditions are giving you patterns that are stronger than the pattern that seems to support their primary nativist hypothesis. So at all levels, what we're really trying to do is an evolutionary epistemology, but that gets very complicated and it gets very methodological very quickly. And the methodologies, in part, among other things, turn very much on the background conceptions we have of the nature of rationality and the nature of epistemology. So, I mean, that's only a partial answer. The philosophy of science issues go all over the place. One that's at least worth mentioning is, well, we have some very strong intuitions that the repetition of A always followed by B gives stronger warrant. Is that rational or not? Is inductivism in that sense rational or not? And even Popper had this intuition and tried to account for it in terms of a couple of attempts he made, neither of which worked. Here's my offer. Suppose you do the experiment again and it works out again. Your favorite hypothesis is not ruled out and your alternative hypotheses are ruled out. Does that give more warrant? Yes, it does. Why does it? Well, it makes even less likely that a pure random result could explain what you've done. But now you do it the 100th time. Does that give any more warrant? Well, it gives a minuscule or infinitesimal amount of warrant, but by the time you do it 100th time, it's just a lab exercise. You're not really testing the hypothesis at all. However, suppose something dawns on you as a potential new control condition and you do it 100 prime times. You reproduce the experiment, but with this new control condition. That really gives more warrant if, in fact, your prime hypothesis is the only one not ruled out. And notice I keep saying the only one not ruled out because it's not like it provides inductive positive support. What it does is provide ruling out plausible alternatives. And if all or most of the plausible alternatives have been ruled out, you've got warrant for accepting what's left. I might point out still a further consequence of this way of thinking about it that seems counterintuitive if you're thinking in terms of classical inductivism. And that is, suppose you have two theoretical frameworks, A and B, and a lot of the consequences of A and a lot of the consequences of B don't overlap with each other, but some of them do. So they are rivals with respect to this intersection of potential consequences. What happens if B is infirmed by some result? Does that actually increase the warrant for A, even if the result is not in the domain of relevance of A? And within this kind of a framework, yes, it does. Because it is ruling out, or at least adding warrant to the ruling out of B, which is an alternative to A. This just sounds totally nuts to people who are buried in classical inductivist frameworks. Just to give you a little twist on it, I might point out that I'm describing this in very general terms, but this exact same point holds for Bayesian models. The warrant attributed by Bayesian analysis, if you have a new hypothesis within a framework of alternative hypotheses, will give you more warrant, more probability, which I think is a bad way of thinking about it, but that's the way the Bayesians talk about it, will give you more probability for what's left if you rule out B, even if the ruling out of B is on the basis of some result that A doesn't even address. So any kind of a decision theory framework is always a decision among alternatives. And Bayesian is a decision theoretic framework. And science, I would claim, is a decision theoretic process. It's not a naive inductivist process. I can go on and on, but anyway, so there's a couple of responses to your question.
Oh, I see Bert already exited. I just wanted to say, because Bert had to go, I wanted to say thank you and goodbye, but he is gone. So let's thank him while he is absent. Ruth?
Yeah. Ruth Milligan, yeah, my video has disappeared again. I've got some problems here, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure, yes.
I'm audible, okay. I wanted to put together something from the very beginning, something that Ruth said, along with something that Bert said. If it's actually true, well, Ruth was emphasizing the importance of context and understanding language. And if it's actually correct that understanding language is really kind of a form of distal perception, that has to be argued for carefully. And actually, I have argued for it carefully. But if that's true, then understanding language is really continuous with understanding natural signs. You know, when ordinary perception is, what is it? Well, it's natural signs that hit the retina, the ears, etc. Right? And somehow or other, you interpret, you translate these signs, these natural signs, or you use them in one way or another. And if speech is the same kind of thing, except that it usually indicates something more distal from you, then you could see that context and speech might be very close together. And I've actually argued that that linguists have made a mistake in not realizing that objects around you can actually be part of language. There's, for instance, demonstratives. The object that is pointed to is actually incorporated into, it's a piece of the sign. And so for indexicals. But in general, it seems to me that if that's correct, that understanding language is a form of perception, that yes, you would get the result exactly, that context was hugely important, that there was no, there was no place where the language stopped and the world began, as it were. So.
Lenny, do you want to respond to that, since making
multimodal? I'm in full agreement. There's nothing more I can add to that. I completely agree that you can create signs. Most linguistic signs include the physical environment as well. there is no ungrounding in that sense. Yeah.
Okay, so Ruth Campson.
I wanted to ask Mark a question as a follow-up to that, because if we're trying to look at language through process, one of the things which is most striking to look at is language change. So language change over centuries is sort of fascinating because it's the way in which things which humans, individuals do together, they're doing in order to form part of this community, let's say, in some sense. And now it's late for me, so my language will get much sloppier. But I want to know, as a methodology, what one does. Can one do serious work on change across times without induction? Because clearly I've been a populator all my working life until this point, but suddenly I'm faced with all these things about language change that I want to look at. And I'm now perplexed as to how to make the marriage between going with a hypothesis, but then all you've got is the access to these corpora of bits of language from across time. I mean, is this, I mean, this is a question rather come off the top of my head, but is this a puzzle which deductivists have to worry about? Because it seems historical linguistics is, well, not historical linguistics is done by the Chomskys, because that's just crap in my view. But the more historical, traditional linguists, you know, they look at corpora. They are deeply inductive.
Well, I think the answer to that rests on the observation that what people call induction is more, in a Popperian terminology, hypothesis testing.
Right.
But it's hypothesis testing without explicit experiment. So, I mean, in that sense, it's like a good deal of astronomy. We don't do terribly many experiments with stars and galaxies.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we can't test hypotheses.
Right.
And the same with the past, including the past of language. We've got all kinds of things there that we can observe and use them to test hypotheses, both in the sense of, well, if this hypothesis were correct, then that would have never happened. And here it is happening in history. So it tends to rule it out. Or the converse, which is a little more problematic, but I think also exists. If this hypothesis were correct, this would happen, but there's no evidence of it. That's not a direct refutation, but it's an anomaly, or it's problematic in some sense or another. So I think we can do hypothesis testing even without experiment.
I mean, one of the interesting cases of that, which I've just, I mean, my student of mine two of them were brooding about, which language change is this beautiful case of how patterns which look as though they're pragmatic patterns in Latin, let's say, but also came from looking at Japanese. But when you come to the calcification in these clitic pronouns in the Romance languages, there are these odd gaps. And it's the gaps. These things never occurred because in the source language from which they came, there were various pragmatic pressures determining that they never arose. Now, here's me sitting in an armchair when faced with students asking me these questions. And I, you know, when we looked at these clitic puzzles, we could see, wow, they never occurred. Why did they never occur? Well, because in the source language, the pragmatic pressures were determining that they wouldn't. So, and routinization then, you don't routinization over something which hasn't occurred, it gets left out because it never occurred.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems to me that one of the properties of language, one of the characteristics of language that is overlooked by a lot of people, not necessarily by you folks, but it's an evolutionary process.
Right.
It's a variation and selection process.
Yes.
And the course of a variation and selection process depends not only on the selections, although it does a whole lot, but it also depends on the variations. It depends on what is the ground, the framework within which the variations are generated. Variations are not a uniform probability distribution over all conceptual possibilities. And if I say it that way, that just makes it obvious. But the conclusion from that is that variations are themselves going to be historistically constrained.
Right, right.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Terry.
Yeah, I didn't want to take it too far since we're close to the end. I just wanted to say that my main worry in this discussion is that we tend to go to extremes, that we can collapse language just to interaction, or that we can collapse language just to systemic formalisms. My view is that we tend to react and go to one extreme or the other. And in fact, everything that we've been saying is, of course, it's this complicated mix. There are systemic features. The systemic features show up more so when we pull language out of context. So, think about the difference between recorded speech and written language. In our recorded speech, context matters so much. But as soon as we leave that and we now write something down, we have to fill in what context was filling in, what presuppositions were filling in. We have to provide that, and it forces us into intense systematicity. And what we find is that, of course, grammar and syntax begin to matter more and more as we pull things out of context. And this is telling us that both sides of this story are relevant. And I just, it's, as I mentioned before, I've been in, as many of you have, probably in constant battle with Noam Chomsky over this. In one respect, I recognize the importance of systematicity that came with his work. And the question is to figure out how to take it out of this extreme in which it's sort of this homunculus of systematicity that he wants to throw into it. But systematicity is real, and it becomes more or less important, again, depending on context, embeddedness, or context, a de-embeddedness. I'll leave it at that. So it's about methodology. The question is that I think we need to keep our methodology open.
Eleni?
Well, I wanted to respond to that because nobody disputes the fact that there is systematicity, and there is systematicity at many levels. But regarding the example that you gave, comparing corpora of transcribed spoken language and written texts, this dichotomy that people used to look at and be so impressed has completely collapsed now, because if you look at the data that you get from online chat, you will see that spoken language, the patterns that you see in spoken language that people call messy, performance, impossible to analyze, no systematicity, are replicated when people interact with each other in dialogue, but through writing. And the data there are no less apparently messy and non-systematic as the ones that we get from spoken language. So it's not about it's not about whether written language has more constraints, it's whether you have a dialogue or a monologue. When you have a monologue, when you write a book, yes, that what you're saying might be that you are increasing the systematicity, you are decreasing the reliance on context, but it has nothing to do with written language versus spoken language. It's just the way of interacting with the other person.
No, I agree entirely. I'm referring just to the fact that when you pull things out of context, that context is an interactive context. And so dialogue is a part of it. What we're doing here, so much of what we said, if we were to listen to the last 5 minutes, as Mark has been pointing out again and again, anyone would be lost because there's so much that's become, the system is so much outside of our spoken material. It's so much in the predispositions that we've developed, listening to each other and responding to each other. So I'm not disagreeing with that. I just wanted to point out that we need to keep both sides of the story in mind.
Okay, so let me make a segue to the last issue I want to bring up, and then we can call it a night, I think, because everyone is already quite tired. So the question of the meta-theoretical question of how to organize the field, that was in the questions I sent you. So we have the separation of linguistics into syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, and so on. We have psychology as a different discipline. So obviously the idea of action-based language kind of completely blurs those differences. So how do you think we should potentially distribute the labor here? I think Ruth has some, Ruth Campson has some
Well, the first thing is I mean, the way you worded it in what you sent round to us, sort of, you could put more bluntly, given your view, you know, we can just get rid of linguistics because it's part of psychology. So those guys can just, we don't need to pay them any longer. Thank you very much. But actually, I think there's something, sorry, I'll take my polo out of my mouth. There are aspects of language at every level which critically nobody other than linguists will probably want to study. So you get phonological clusters at the end of syllables or precluded from the beginning of syllables. What the sound system of the language is giving you is a means of clustering, chunking things up into units, which you then deal at some other level. Morphology will then give you things. And if I say to you, you know I'm asking you to begin to construct a term. If I say to you, the or a, any of those determinants, they act as a left edge on constructing a term. And then in these verb final languages, the case will almost always go on the end. And the case not only gives you some idea of its thematic role, that's everybody looks at content, it'll also tell you that that term is finished. You don't need any more information to know what to do with that. And lo and behold, if you've got a verb final language, which allows these very free orders, that the tense suffix always comes after the verb, and it's acting as a sign that you've got everything now in your sequence of terms that you can compile them together. So why I'm saying this, the phonology and the morphology will give you boundary effects, which the child has to acquire. And as you know yourself, when you're first confronted with a new language, you get used to it, and you get used to clustering these things in units. And so I think the kind of job that linguists do has to be transformed so that they look in terms of language as a process. But I don't think they will ever necessarily just be put out to grass. But having said that, I think the sociology, we could all, I mean, God, in this community, we could all share stories of academic sociology, which would make one furious and laugh together over. But that, I think, is another, I wouldn't want to raise that one, I'll go on for hours.
All right, thanks. Joanna and Mark, final comments.
Okay, so I will just take this discussion out of the technical questions, which were very, very informative, and just say that one of the goals, I think, of our lab, which is the Human Interactivity and Language Lab, is sort of to maybe not so much to see how the true, I mean, to design the best model for language, but perhaps realizing how much violence and how much good we can do with language, and which use of language, sensitivity to what in language and interactivity brings us closer to the good, to the values. So what I wanted to say is that that just this is a value realizing process, and I think that it's so important to situate it in as a value realizing process, because of course curiosity and building the best model ever or the closest asymptotically to how things are is important, but then we will never do this. Of course, all our models will be wrong, but we can also realize different values, and this is very appealing to me, and perhaps in interactivism it sort of is brought forward. Maybe the experience is still not so much underscored as it should be, the first person, second person experience, but we are getting there with our relational approach. I think we are in the right position to hook the phenomena that we are studying to how we feel and the feelings and experiences they bring out in us. So just to bring it on a different level.
All right, Mark?
This is a question I used to ask every linguist I ran into. So given that we've got two major linguists here, at least two, maybe three, I'd like to ask it. And it's relevant in the following sense. we have an apperceptive process going on when we're understanding language, whether our own utterances or somebody else's utterances. And in the middle of an utterance, the apperceptive process involves how do we recapture where the utterance, where the apperception is supposed to go and what it's supposed to connect with. Okay. Various kinds of things in language help with that. So here's my question. Do either of you know, this is an old vocabulary, so it may not even make sense, which is why I've stopped asking it, but do any of you know of a left branching non-agglutinative language? And the reason I ask is that it seems to me that left branchingness makes figuring out which apperceptive processes go with other apperceptive processes particularly difficult unless you've got agglutinations, which can give you all the clues for that. So if you've got a left branching language with no agglutinative characteristics, it would be particularly difficult to recover how the compositions are supposed to occur.
When you say left branching,
Yes.
you mean when you are parsing the thing that you have in English, John's book? Is that what would be a left branching structure?
Well, or like in English, unlike some languages, adjectives precede nouns. That's left branching. English is primarily right branching, but it's got some exceptions. But if all of language is left branching in that sense, that modifiers precede what they modify, it's very difficult to figure out and recapture what the modification relationships are supposed to be. I mean, that was the intuition behind the question anyway. And in any case, even if the answer is, oh yes, you know 6 dozen languages like that, I think the point in principle still holds. There are constraints on the way to put things together, at least in terms of how much processing it takes to figure out how to put them together. And the conventions of a language may work to help that process of how to put the compositions together.
Mark, would this, maybe another way to ask this question, would head final versus head initial languages
Yes.
also help this question?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's why I say it's an old vocabulary.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yes, I wanted to say in response to that. So it is an old vocabulary, and I'm not sure if this is an answer to a question, but the answer is that verb initial languages mirror, they're the reverse mirror image of what verb final languages do. So verb final languages do, they have what I told you before, they have these terms, term, verb, and then the verb, it's clustered, it'll have suffixes on it, which determine how you put the combination together. Verb initial language is the one you want. Verb initial languages, I noted, were just the mirror image of that, because what they're doing is in the Japanese case, it's the closure things which are determining the boundary. In the verb initial languages, it's the opening which is determining the boundary from what went before. And they have all just the reverse of that. So they'll have tense very early on. They'll have agreement markers very early on. They'll all be clustered as prefixes on these auxiliaries, which give you immediately start giving you event terms. And those are helping you guide you into building a term which is boundary off from what went before it. And I think looking at it in process terms will give you different answers to wording it in ways which talk about left branching, and because the it's also true that the verb initial languages they're more agglutinative. What's agglutinative? It's very complicated morphology, isn't it? Isn't that what agglutinative? I mean, it's partially also terminological. I mean, you look at Swahili, look at the Bantu languages, and any morphologist, old style morphologist, they have a really complicated morphology. And you look at those languages and you put your glasses at the end of your nose and you think, oh, that looks to me remarkably like Romance, except they've all pushed them together and written them as one word. So my hunch is that the old vocabulary of agglutinative, on the assumption that that is unproblematic, probably has to be rethought in processing terms, and then looking at how languages determine boundaries in real time, and how that affects the morphology and the order of words is the way to look for an answer. But I can see it's not a direct answer to what you said, quite.
Okay.
I guess it also depends whether it's prefixes or suffixes, right? Like if a language had only prefixes, then the problem that
well, most of us have mixed, of course, unfortunately. Yeah. But yes, verb initial languages tend to have more. I think they have many more prefixes. I just remember somebody giving a talk, and I thought, "Whoa, that's the mirror image of Japanese." I just, I had a student work on Japanese, and there was this woman giving us all these complicated prefixes in these verb initial languages, and it just seemed to me obvious that there was this sort of counterpart, complementarity between these things, which strikingly needed to be explained in processing terms. And again, boundary indicators. And you can, how do you tell whether you've got a new thing you're supposed to be building? Well, either by marking the new one or by marking the old one. And the verb final languages go for marking the end, whereas the verb initial languages go by marking what's the beginning. I mean, there's just in very crude terms. But again, you think in processing with processing spectacles on, and you find that you're giving different answers. Or suggesting new hypotheses, which one could then see whether they were rubbish and false or not.
Okay, let's thank our panelists and well, everybody. Let's thank ourselves.
Yes, thank you for staying up so late.
And yeah, I hope we can continue discussing those issues in the future, and most closely tomorrow, possibly some of them. So yeah, let's hope to see you tomorrow at well, various hours depending on the time zones. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. You've nearly got to midnight, haven't you, Robert? Very nearly got to midnight.
Yeah,
Rob, haven't you?
I think it's later at your. No, it's an hour earlier, right?
We're almost at midnight.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Istanbul.
Right.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
the great discussion.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Okay.